Hi everybody. Today we are with Aaron from Glyph Services. They do translation and localization for games, and so we're here with Aaron, the CEO, and he's gonna give this presentation. He's gonna explain about localization business and what they do. So I'll give it to you, Aaron. Go ahead.
Okay, great. Nice to see all of you who will be seeing this later online. I'll say a quick hello in person here, and then I'll pull up the screens to walk through the presentation. I'm going to do the presentation in English. If anybody's online and has questions, I can take them in Spanish as well. But I'm going to start walking through the presentation in English. So let me pull up my screen. And all right. Are you seeing that okay?
Yes.
Yes, I see the desktop part.
Do you see the full screen now?
No.
Let's try that again. All right, how's that?
No, maybe you can unshare again.
Okay. Let's try it. Okay, how about that?
No, I keep seeing the same.
Same but very visible.
Yeah, I think maybe we can. Yeah, I think it's visible enough. Maybe can you like where it says click to add notes? Can you lower that part of the screen?
Let's see here. Yeah.
Yeah, I think we can go with that.
That's good.
Yeah.
I could do this too. Okay. Great. So the presentation is generally about games localization and some basic ideas that will help developers to know, if you've never done localization before or if you're new to it, giving you a better idea of how to be successful at games localization. I'll say a little bit about Glyph first. So we're a localization company that specializes in globalization of consumer products and media, including video games, mobile apps, social apps. We were founded in 2001 in Seattle, Washington, in the U.S. We've got about 700 linguists who work for us, and we work into pretty much any language you can think of. We've translated about 50 million words over the years, and we're a team of 35 people based in the U.S., primarily in Spokane, Washington. Just a quick overview of what we do. We do translation, but we do translation with a really particular focus on having really good understanding of the cultural underpinnings of language and what's cool and what's slang and what's fresh in a particular market. We also do a lot of integration of web content, so working with people who have content management systems or homegrown content management systems and helping to integrate translation processes.
Should you be on the next slide, Aaron?
What do you see right now?
Just the first one.
Okay.
Do it right the first time. There we go.
Okay, I guess I'll stay on this view then. We also do trends creation of SEO and PPC. So basically we help people with their digital advertising, not by just translating their keywords in their ads, but by adapting them for the target markets. Same thing with app stores and other discoverability platforms. We do multimedia localization, which is very much related to the games industry. We also do e-learning and other kinds of multimedia. And then finally, we do global market consulting, helping people to understand where are their opportunities in the global market space to expand their brand presence or to sell their product or service. So a lot of times when I talk to games developers, they say, why should we translate our game? It's already selling. People seem to be really happy with the English version of the game. Or, as the case may be, maybe you're publishing in Spanish and everybody loves it. Why translate? Let me give you a few ideas on why it's important to localize. First of all, it depends a little bit on the kind of game. So if you have a casual game with just a few words on every screen, like start or score, some really basic things, maybe you don't have to localize it. It might not be that important. However, if you have an RPG or a game where the content itself is critical to enjoying the game, to playing it, to being successful, you really need to take that into account in terms of providing to your users the best experience. A lot of the people that we work with have found that they'll be able to produce revenue from other markets without translating or localizing their video game. However, what they find is that when they translate, it becomes a more predictable revenue stream. So, for example, you might just see 1 month you're getting a lot of hits in Turkey, and then the next month in Indonesia, and then the next month in Korea. But when you localize, those patterns tend to be more predictable. So you can do planning. If you've got one title out, and you know that generally you get X dollars from Korea, you can rely on that money more in terms of your planning for marketing or for new product development. So predictable revenue is an important reason to localize. Publishing, getting published is another important consideration. At a minimum, publishers want your game to be internationalized. It's a really big problem for most publishers to get a great video game that they have to go in and re-engineer because it wasn't set up to be localized. So at a minimum, make sure that you're doing the basics, and I'll talk more about some game design techniques that help you to be prepared. Yes?
A question here. Right now, the Chinese market, Latin American market is opening up a lot. But do you have any numbers of the impact? Let's say, like how much would a game impact in the Asian market or the Latin market when you localize?
Everybody, that's the question that everybody has, is what is the return on investment? How do you measure that? I'm sure that EA and Sony have some inside numbers that tell you, what happens when you localize. But unfortunately, I don't have any of those numbers. It's really, I think, what I advise people to do is to look at where they're already getting interest. Where do you already see people expressing interest in your game? I think those are definitely opportunities in those markets, but there's not a really easy equation that says, here's what you should expect. One of the big factors in that is that, just because you localize a game doesn't necessarily mean that people like that game. So it's really hard to distinguish between game genre or the exact, the mechanics of a particular game and how that is attractive in a market versus the availability of a localized version. So, quick answer, to summarize, no, I don't have an answer to that. But I think that it's the usual suspects are reasonable. I often advise people to go for the reliable markets. I think that going for markets where that there's a lot of disposable income, like France, Germany, where there's already an established marketplace, is a lower risk scenario than going into a market like China, where there's a huge opportunity, but that's also a really different set of cultural expectations, and it might flop, it might not work. Does that answer your question?
Yeah. Thanks. That's good. Thank you. Continue.
So, a couple other things here are that consumers want to know what they're buying, and I'll speak more to that on my next slide. But the last thing I had on this slide was the idea of bad publicity. And, gamers are notorious for getting onto games forums and talking about the things that they like and the things that they don't like. And, you definitely don't want to be that publisher or the developer who did a game that everybody thought was terrible, either because the translation was bad, or because you just didn't think to localize it, or because you had some culturally offensive elements in your game. So, you definitely don't want bad publicity as it relates to language and culture. So, consumers are cautious. One of the things I wanted to point out here is there was a study from a group in our industry. It's essentially the only company, the only organization that does a lot of industry research for translation and localization. And they have a study that looks at the purchasing activity of individuals on websites. Now, video games, it's not quite the same, although I think it's related. It's essentially saying, what is their purchasing behavior when they're online? And they had a study that showed that they asked the question, will you only buy on a website that's in your language? And 54% of the people who responded, and this was a global survey, responded that they agreed or they strongly agreed with that statement. In particular, in Japan, there was a 73% of the people said that they agreed or strongly agreed that they would only buy on a website in their language. France, Turkey, Germany all had similar behavior. And again, this isn't exactly games, but I do think it's a significant observation that when people are spending money, they want to know what they're spending their money on. Gamers can be a little bit different. In particular, hardcore gamers are, they want the experience, and the language may not be that important. But in particular, if you have, let's say you have a game with in-app purchases, there's a lot of transactions happening, and people feel insecure about making transactions in a language that's not their own. So, just putting that out there as a consideration based on some research in the industry. When you're thinking about translation and localization, it's not an all or nothing consideration. You don't have to go out and translate the game into 50 languages and get it into every market. You can start by simply making it discoverable. So if you've got a mobile game, for example, start by translating the description and the keywords in the App Store. At least you can get more people finding your game and trying it out. Maybe they'll play it in English, but if you don't at least make an attempt, you're really missing out on an opportunity to allow people to find your game and discover it initially. Here I have another note about which languages, which goes back to Luis's question. And I would say, look at your own data, look and see if you already have a whole bunch of people in Russia who are downloading your game. You can probably get a lot more if you translate it into Russian. So, look at your numbers, look to see where your downloads are coming from, and start with that. You can start small. Try one language, try the process, see what what the architectural problems are with your game. Figure out all of the problems that you might run into with a single language first, and then go bigger. Get some data. Try to build your own argument around return on investment, so that you're not just blindly going into new markets. There are different options for how you do translation and localization. Here I have a chart that shows you the options from top to bottom that are, the multi-language vendors are companies like Glyph, who do virtually all languages. It's full service, lots of expertise, consulting, basically can give you, help guide you through the process. That's going to be the most expensive of the different options, but it's also going to be the lowest internal effort. So it's important to understand, if you're going to localize, you're going to spend money on it in all likelihood, and you're going to have internal staff spending time and energy on it. That's a cost. They're both costs to your company. So make sure you're considering both of those things. It might be worth paying more for a multilingual vendor if you have to spend less energy internally. Alternatively, maybe you feel like you have a lot of resources internally and you want to try to reduce the outsourcing cost. If that's the case, you could go to single language vendors. So those are smaller companies that tend to focus on one language or a couple of languages. You could even go directly to freelance translators. You could go out and find people and do the work directly. There are challenges to that because, if you're not an expert at understanding translation, you may get a bad freelancer. You may not know how to determine if the quality of work is good. So there are risks to that, but it's definitely a lower cost. The next step down is in-house translators. And that's really more for the really large companies. If you have enough work that you're just constantly producing new content in a variety of languages, it might be worth having an in-house team. That often doesn't work either, because what happens is they end up doing a lot of non-games translation. They do corporate translations and marketing and other things that are unrelated to the games. So I've seen that, lots of challenges with that approach. The cheapest option on the list here is using your community or your staff to do the translations. It's not an impossible strategy, but it's a very high-risk strategy. You might have very enthusiastic people who are passionate about the game, but they may not have the skills that you need to do great translation. They're also, in particular, if you use your community, they may seem very excited at first and say, yeah, we'll do all the translation, and then, a week later, they're gone because they got busy. They got exams at school, or, something happens and they're just gone. And you're stuck in the middle of the process without anybody to do the work. So, it's not impossible, and if you think you have a good way to get it done, it's not, it's worth considering. But I've seen only a few success cases, very few, and I've seen a lot of people end up doing a lot of work and then later on just starting over and going to find a professional agency to do the work. So, worth considering, but complicated. I wanted to go through a few ideas around game design that will help you to, things that you need to take into account as you're designing a game, so that when you get to localization, you don't have to go back and re-engineer the game. So the first thing is string externalization. I would hope that this is pretty standard by now, but there are still cases where people hard code strings into the game, and that's just, it doesn't work for localization. All of the strings, all the on-screen content needs to be externalized in some sort of a resource file. There's lots of flexibility about what kind of resource file, but it does need to be externalized. In part because it's easier for localization, but it also it's easier for loading content based on language settings in browsers or device settings. So make sure that you're externalizing strings. Do not use variables to build strings. It's a terrible, terrible thing to do because just because something works in Spanish or in English, where you put together two parts of a sentence, or you plug in somebody's name as a variable in the middle of a sentence, those kinds of things break very, very easily when you start to translate them into other languages, because other languages have different rules about gender or number or any variety of different grammatical linguistic elements that make that a really very bad strategy. So I very much advise you to avoid that. The other thing, and this goes to the picture on the screen, is make sure that your art matches the strings. So this screenshot is from a hidden object game, and they translated all of the the strings that show up for telling you what to look for in the image. So in this case, the German got translated Zeitgesellschaft, but the actual item on the screen, Time Society, the art never got updated. So this is a particular example, but just make sure that your art and your strings match, and that you don't forget that there's some piece of art that has content in it. A couple of other ideas. A really common issue with game design is that when you translate, often the amount of text increases significantly. It could be twice as much text. So when you're doing the design, really be conscious of not packing in too much content in a small amount of space. In particular, if you're doing a mobile game, you have to be very conscious of not putting too much content in, because when it gets translated, it's going to either you're going to have to redesign the screen in the translated version, or you're going to have to reduce the font size, and it could end up being so small that users have a hard time reading it. So make sure you're thinking about text expansion. It's also important to think about dynamic UIs. If you have a dynamic UI, that allows for some resizing based on the amount of text that is showing up in translation. You can also look at using symbols. Now, symbols can have some risk because there are sometimes cultural issues related with symbols. So for example, we did a product once that had a security feature, and they used a shield for the symbol. But the shield that they used, and they were localizing into Arabic. The shield that they used was almost identical to the shield from the Crusades. And it was a very offensive image to use in the software, and they had to redesign the art because the symbol was very bad. So, be careful with your symbols to be sensitive culturally, but you can take advantage of things like green and red, check mark and X, like at the right, that often for a lot of cultures will be very understandable. The other thing is font support. Make sure that the fonts that you're using to display the content are going to actually support the character sets. So this is an example of a French localization where the word for egg in French, it didn't appear properly, and it ended up looking like a mistake. But the problem was not a linguistic mistake; it was a display mistake, because the correct font, that font didn't support the character that you needed to write that word in French. So let's talk a little bit about project planning. A lot of times people come to us and want to start a localization project without really having thought about the bigger picture. So it's important to do this kind of thinking before you begin. And ideally, you want to start this as you're developing the game, not after you've developed it. But the first thing is be very cautious of content management systems. A lot of times, with games development, it sometimes is less relevant because often you're using a framework to build the game. But if you do have some sort of a content management system that you have designed, that can be a really challenging issue when you're determining good workflows for getting content out of the content management system, translated, and back in to publish. So if you do have that, make sure that you bring that up with your vendor right away so that you can discuss that and work out a strategy. The second item there is finish the game before you localize. And that might seem obvious, but it happens all the time that people send over a game to be localized. The vendor will start working on it, and then we get halfway through and they say, oh, wait, by the way, we need to change these two things. And it's a really, really terrible thing for a localization provider to have a change midstream. There's a really high risk of files getting messed up, of your database of content having incorrect translations in it, and it really can just delay the whole thing. Plus, translators hate it, so you want happy translators working on your game because then they'll be inspired and they'll give you great work, rather than feeling like you're changing the rules on them. So make sure it's finished before you just start to localize. Set realistic timelines. Don't have a 50,000 word RPG and then show up and say, can we have this by Friday? It's just not going to work. I mean, there are limits to how quickly, in the same way that you can't, if a publisher came to you and said, make this game by tomorrow and make it really cool and make it, work very well, you're never going to be able to do that because there's a limit. Same thing with translation. You can't just pump out translations at a magical speed. Plan for your own internal inefficiencies. Even if you're working with a multi-language vendor, you are going to have to spend time managing the translation and localization process. You will need resources internally to set up staging sites or to do test builds. You will have to have people available to answer questions because the localization team is not going to know immediately every detail about what you want this game to communicate. So be sure you're planning for an interruption in your lives while you're doing this, because it's definitely going to happen. And then the last thing there is thinking about the update cycles. So it's important, in particular if you have the kind of game where you're releasing new content for the game on a regular basis, which is increasingly common in the industry. You need to work out a plan, both from several perspectives. First of all, from technology perspective, what's going to be the easiest way to move content? Let's say you have a weekly cycle for developing new content. You want to make sure that you have a pretty easy system of doing those updates technologically, so that you're not constantly doing lots of things like copy and paste or constant import export. Think through how you're going to do that kind of update. Talk to your localization vendor about pricing and figuring out how can you avoid paying really high fees for those updates. Often when you have small amounts of content, that can be challenging for localization providers to process unless you talk to them about your expectations. So, have conversations about the updates and where you expect that to go. A few notes on technology. So machine translation is often an attractive option for people. They just say, well, let's just do Google Translate and be done and it'll be fine. that just doesn't work. Machine translation is an interesting technology, and it does work for some kinds of content. But machine translation requires engine training and engine development for the specific kinds of content that you want to translate. So you can't expect that any machine translation engine is going to be good at translating your content without some specific upfront work. So I recommend against that. You're better off just finding somebody's cousin to translate it for you than using machine translation for, in particular, for creative content. The second item there is using translation memory. So you may not be familiar with translation memory, but it's pretty standard in our industry. It's essentially a bilingual database that stores all of these strings that you translate over time. It's a great way to be consistent with previous work that you've done, and it's an important way to bring down costs when you do updates. So make sure that whoever you're working with for translation does have a translation memory database that they're building for you, and that you can access that. Testing setup, make sure you think through how you are going to do builds or staging sites. Work that out with your vendor up front, because when you get done with the initial translation localization, you don't want to have a roadblock where you can't start doing testing because the setup isn't there. And then finally, bug tracking. Talk to your vendor about what software you're going to use for bug tracking. Make sure that you are expecting there to be functional issues that show up. So localization testing is not going to simply reveal, well, hopefully it will only reveal linguistic issues, but in all probability there will be functional issues that come up during that testing. So you should be expecting to spend some time fixing bugs, partly related to language, but also related to functional aspects of the game. And then also when you're looking at bug tracking and changes, make sure you're very clear about who is going to own those updates. Sometimes what happens is your vendor, your testing vendor, will suggest changes during the testing process, and then you will just make those updates. Or maybe somebody on your team speaks the language, they see a word that they don't like, they make a change, and you're good. That's fine on the publishing side. The problem is that if you don't communicate those changes back to your localization vendor, your database is not going to be clean. And you really want to have that translation memory database updated, clean with the final content. So make sure you have a good feedback loop to support that bug tracking process and bug resolution process. A couple more things here. I put this slide in. It says language quality is interpretive. And the reason I put that in is that language is a subjective art. Often people expect translators to read their minds. In particular, this happens in the games industry a lot, where game developers are very passionate about their content, about their characters, about the style in their game. And it's really important to understand that translators aren't necessarily going to get that immediately. You have to communicate with them, and it takes time to develop an understanding of what you want. So I put that out there just because it's important to not expect people to produce exactly the style you want without some hard work on both sides. And the last thing I have here is I just wanted to give you a few notes about what it takes to get high quality with translation and localization. The first thing is really related to terminology. In my experience, people typically don't like translations, not because the general wording is bad, but they typically don't like a translation because one particular word sounds bad to them, or they think it's wrong. So make sure that when you're doing localization that you are focusing on terminology initially and being very clear about how you are framing the key words that define the experience of your game. The second item is localization versus rewriting. So a lot of times, and again, this is very common in the games industry, because there's so much creativity that goes into the design of a game, often developers and publishers expect that localization will produce a brand new rewritten version of their game. That's possible. You can do that. Glyph does that. We take content written in one language and we will rewrite it for a new culture, a new market. However, that's not standard localization. Standard localization is you do an adaptation, but it's only as good as the original content, and it needs to stay relatively true to the original source content. If you want a vendor to really recreate the content in your game for a new market, you have to expect to pay for that. It's a creative service, very much like writing, and you need to make sure that you differentiate between localization and recreation of your content. The third point I have is working with your vendor to create a quality plan. It's important that you sit down at the beginning of the process to discuss what quality means to you, what your expectations are, understand your vendor's process for producing quality, and then make sure that you have conversations about that during the project. Typically, if you do that, you'll end with the vendor will be clear about what you want, and you'll end up with a higher quality product at the end. And the last thing, and this is sort of related to that same point, is, it's important that you find long-term relationships with vendors that you like. A lot of times, and again, there's a lot of idiosyncrasies about the games industries and this is another one. Often in the games industry, work revolves around a particular title or a particular piece of IP. And a lot of times, publishers or developers will want to work with a localization vendor for that title, and then as soon as that title is published, they forget about it and until the next one comes along, and then they start over again. And they just find whoever is the cheapest or whoever's easy available to do the work. It's not a very good strategy because it takes time to really understand your style, your vision, your creative content, and if you work with a vendor over time, you're going to get a lot better quality, and you're going to get better pricing, and you're going to get more responsiveness. So I guess I'm just recommending that you find people that you like to work with. Expect to have to work with them to get the quality that you want. Invest time and energy in that over the long term, rather than going out and just trying something new every single time. So that's about it. That's a quick overview of the industry. Are there any questions that anybody wants to ask?
Yeah, I have a couple here.
Mm-hmm.
That was great, thank you. The first one would be going back to the production part where you're saying times. So how's the pipeline to working with you, and like time frame and pipeline like files? So yeah, so like let's say I want to start working with you and we have So you measure it by words, or how do you measure it?
Yep. So, well, the first thing to say on that is you should start talking to a localization vendor during design. Don't wait until the end. Start
It's good to
talking to
know.
them early because they can give you a lot of the ideas and they can help look at it. You can look at it early, and then before you set everything in stone, you can make some changes. So start early. From there, the more advance notice you can give a vendor, the better. So at a minimum, you want to try to tell them a week or two before you're going to start, this is what our plan is, and we think that we'll be ready in 2 weeks. That's a really important thing to do because then they'll make sure that they have their best translators ready to do your work. In terms of mapping the time, a really common metric in the industry is to assume about 2,000 words per day. So, and again, that works for small volumes. If you have a really huge game, then it's not going to be like that. If you have 1 million words, then what we would do is we would probably have 10, 15 translators, and so then it would be 20,000 words a day, or something like that. But typically, one translator can produce 2,000 words a day, and I would expect at least, if you have a small game, expect at least a week for the translation, and then expect another week for you to figure out how to do a test build or to get a staging website up and running, and then expect another week for the testing to happen. So at a minimum, I would plan for a month if it was me.
That's good to know.
Even for just a small thing. And then, beyond that, we would be able to tell you really specifically, digging into the details, how long something would take.
Okay, that's good to know. And what about like slangs, like small phrases? If you translate it word by word, it won't make any sense. I know you were mentioning that in the presentation.
Mm-hmm.
How would that work?
Well, so what we do on those cases is, that happens a lot in video games, right? Where you'll have a section where it says, way to go, right?
Yeah.
But you can't say way to go in Spanish. This is not going to translate. So what we do, is sit down and talk to you about who are your gamers, right? Who is your target demographic? What markets? So like for Spanish, if you're targeting, Mexico, for example, the way that you would say way to go is probably different than what it would be in Argentina, right? Like people have different styles of saying things. So you talk about the cultures that you're targeting, the education level, gender, age, all of those typical demographics, and then the localization company should be able to produce a translation that is idiomatically right, for those kinds of short phrases. But you're right; those are challenging. You have to be very aware of that, and those are good things to check for quality.
Okay, thanks. I do have another one here. It's more about the business side. Since the industry changes a lot, right? And then there's ups and downs, and like mobile games, it's hard to make money there. So I think this question is more of a person that is thinking about opening a service similar to you.
Mm-hmm.
How do you see the type of business and localization, like self-maintaining or going up like that?
Yeah. Are you talking about the games industry specifically?
Yeah.
Localization for games? Yeah. Well, it's hard. I mean, it's. I think it's not going away for sure, because global publishing just keeps growing and growing and growing. Mm-hmm. The challenge is that nobody wants to spend money on localization until they already have a winner, right? Yeah. And then they want to win everything. They want to win the whole world with a winner. I think it's not a very smart way to do business, but that's just how most publishers work. They don't think big picture. So I think the key is really finding, for the localization side of this, if you're a localizer, it's important to just have a pretty broad set of clients who are targeting, a wide range of products. And it's also important to just specialize. So if you're going to be a games localizer, and you specialize in that, there are definitely opportunities because there aren't that many people who are really good at doing the work. So I think there's a lot of opportunity there, but it's not the kind of thing where, let's say that you're a translator and you want to be in the industry, you can't just go out and say, well, I'm an expert at legal and financial and science and literature and wine, and I'm also an amazing video game translator. Because it's just not very believable. Yeah. So I think the key is just specializing, knowing, what are the idiosyncrasies of games, and then being persistent, having lots of clients that you can work with.
Okay, great, thank you. And I think the last one here, it's about price. So do you have some packages, or can you give us an overall on the price?
Yeah, I mean, typically the pricing for localization it differs by company to company, and it also differs depending on the size. So, I mean, if you're doing, the next big Blizzard game, versus the next Mahjong game, right? It's a huge difference in the amount of content and the complexity of the content. So, if you're Blizzard, you're going to get a much cheaper price than somebody doing a small game. But generally, the pricing for localization tends to be pretty consistent. It ranges, for multi-language vendors, so companies like Glyph, it's going to be usually in the range of 15 to 25 cents a word. That's a pretty common range of pricing. Usually it's per word. That's usually what the main item that people target for their pricing. I usually recommend to people that if you want to have like a rough estimate of how much a game would cost, figure out how many words you have in the whole thing, and then multiply it by 0.25.
Okay, perfect. That's great.
Yeah, it won't be exact, but it'll at least give you an idea of whether it's $100 or $10,000, right?
Okay. Yeah. That's a really good average. Great. I think I don't have any questions. If I have more, I'll redirect it to you. So you can you show them your info, your contact info?
Yeah, let me put it back up.
Thanks for a few seconds.
Yeah, sure. All right. Can you see that?
Yes, perfect.
Yeah.
Okay, let's
so
give it a
feel free to shoot me an email if you have any questions, and we'd be happy to help you out.
Okay, yeah. So I think that's it. Thank you very much, Aaron. This was great. Thank you very much. So so everybody that is interested, just feel free to send Aaron an email, or let me know, and I can also put you in touch with them. So yeah, that's it. Thank you very much, Aaron.
All right. Thank you.
All right.
Bye-bye.
Bye.